So continuing, this is a monohybrid cross because it was a cross examining only one characteristic. Okay. And what he found in the F1 generation was that all of the offspring had purple flowers, which is interesting if you think about that, because the purple flower from one of the parents came through to the next generation, but the white color from one of the other parents did not come through in the F1 generation. It basically disappeared. So Mendel was able to figure out that the genetic information, the gene for flower color in the white flower parents did not simply disappear in the F1 generation genetically, even though the white color, the characteristic, did disappear, but the genetic information, the gene for white color, did not disappear. It was simply hidden or masked in the F1 generation. He was able to determine this because when he did an F1 cross, that means when he bred the F1 generation with each other, the offspring, if you want to think of it as the grandkids, the offspring, the F2 generation, had, no surprise, purple color flowers. But interestingly, the white color flower reappeared. And since he did this experiment many times, he was able to count the actual number of individuals in the F1 generation and then in the F2 generation. And he found another interesting thing. 3/4 of the F2 generation, 75%, produced purple flowers, and 1/4, 25% of the F2 generation produced the white flower. And this was the situation for all of the characteristics he observed, whether it was pea color, pea shape, the position of the flower, the height of the flowering plant, etc. In the F2 generation, it was always this 75% to 25%, or in simpler terms, this 3-to-1 ratio. And Mendel was able to explain why and how this occurred. So he was able to determine that the F1 generation must have the genetic information, the genes, for the two traits, for, in this example, flower color. Because that's the only way to explain why in the F2 generation the trait of the two different flower colors reappeared. As we see here. And by the way, one of the earlier tables that will come up again, that will pop up again, we call the trait that appears in the F1 generation and in the F2 generation as the dominant trait, and the trait that disappears, or it's masked or hidden in the F1 generation but reappears in the F2 generation as the recessive trait. So from the results, Mendel was able to develop 4 hypotheses. One, that there are alternate versions of the genes that we call alleles. Notice this is a dominant allele here and a recessive allele. We'll talk about what this shape is in a minute here. But there are alternate versions of genes that account for the variations in the inherited characteristics. The alternate versions of the genes are called alleles. So if we consider the flower color, right, the characteristic is color, and the traits are purple and white. So there's a bit of genetic information that's called a gene that determines the flower color. And since there are two flower colors, there must be two versions of the genes. Excuse me, my cursor goes to sleep. There must be two versions of the genes, and those two different versions are called alleles. So there's an allele for the purple flower color, and then there's an allele for the white flower color. Excuse me. And for each inherited character, like flower color, an organism inherits two alleles, one from each parent. So if you go back and look at that figure where it has the F1 generation and the individuals are all the same color, purple flowers, that individual inherited one allele from one parent and one allele from the other parent. So the alleles are inherited in pairs, and the pairs come from the parent. So an organism with two identical alleles for a specific gene is referred to as homozygous. Homo for similar or same. So and we'll talk about this more, the true breeding parents were or are homozygous for a particular allele. However, if an organism has two different alleles for any particular gene, that organism is referred to as heterozygous, hetero for different. And in the F1 generation, those purple flowers, those purple flowering plants were heterozygous for the particular allele of flower color. So what you have down here at the in this figure are pairs of chromosomes that are inherited from parents, and those are referred to as homologous chromosomes because they're similar. And this would be a chromosome, and this would be the other chromosome. In this example, they're only color-coded to indicate that they're inherited, one from a parent and one from another parent. So you can think of maybe the red one coming from the mother plant or the mother individual, inherited from that one, and the blue color could be inherited then from the father. Okay? And notice that this says dominant allele and this says recessive allele. We can consider the dominant allele the allele that has the genetic information, the gene, for the dominant flower color, in this case purple, and the recessive allele for the recessive flower color, in this case white. Okay, so another hypothesis. If the two alleles for the inherited characteristic differ, then one determines the organism's appearance. In other words, if the individual is heterozygous, having a dominant allele and a recessive allele, then the dominant allele will determine the organism's appearance, and the other allele will have no effect on the organism's appearance, and that allele is referred to as the recessive allele. And again, if we consider that F1 generation in the pea plants, excuse me, my cursor, here we go. The purple color is the dominant characteristic trait, so it is determined and controlled by the dominant allele. And then the white color that's not seen in the F2 generation is the recessive allele. So we use capital or lowercase letters written in italic form to represent the dominant and recessive alleles. So notice there's a capital B here and a lowercase b here. So we'll use the capital, or we use capital letters for the dominant allele and lowercase for the recessive allele. And notice it's the same letter, P and P, capital B, lowercase b. All right? And then lastly, a sperm or an egg will carry only one allele for each inherited character because the two alleles for the characters separate or segregate during gamete formation. Okay. If you remember, during meiosis, the genetic information separates when gametes are formed because the chromosomes, the homologous chromosomes, separate during gamete formation. So this is Mendel's law of segregation that occurs during gamete formation during meiosis. And we can use a bookkeeping helper, something called a Punnett Square, to keep track of the genetics, the alleles that are contributed by the parents and how they separate during meiosis, and how those alleles can come together during fertilization of the gametes, sperm and egg. And that's what's shown down here. Notice sperm and eggs. And what goes in the Punnett Square is the possible combination of the genetic information from the two parents, and the alleles that can come together will determine the physical characteristic of the offspring. So the Punnett Square is used to keep track of the possible combination of the gametes, and the genetic information then determines the physical characteristic of the offspring. So this is used to determine the possible offspring in both the F1 and the F2 generation. And each square represents the equal probable product of fertilization. In simpler terms, or in a simpler example, if you consider human reproduction, you'll have the offspring being, say, male or female. So if a woman has a child, there's a 50% chance of the child being a female, or a 50% chance of the offspring being a male. Okay. However, if a female, theoretically, let's say a female had 100 children, on average, 50% of the offspring would be male, 50% would be female. Okay. So here's showing a Punnett Square of the possible offspring in the F2 generation coming from the initial parental cross. Here would be the F1 generation. Remember, all purple flowers, because the purple characteristic is dominant, the white's recessive. And we'll talk about the flow of genetic information to determine the color in the F1 generation. And we'll talk about the flow of information from the F1 cross and how that's used to determine, using a Punnett Square, the genetic information in the F2 generation, and that means also the physical characteristic in the F2 generation. So Mendel, excuse me, found that all the characteristics had the same inheritance pattern, followed the same rules of inheritance, where a particular trait disappeared in the F1 generation. In this example, flower color, the white color, which is referred to as recessive, and the color or the trait that was passed on and visible in the F1 generation is referred to as the dominant trait. And notice in the F2 generation, the recessive trait reappears. So the mechanism is explained by Mendel's law of segregation, where the alleles segregate because the alleles are on chromosomes during gamete formation, and then the fusion of the gametes create the allele pairs in the offspring. So for example, in gamete formation, notice capital P's, so the dominant alleles, we have a pair of alleles, and during gamete formation, Notice